Do now is call Mr. Kempton up, since we're talking about Orange County, Mr. Soloria, and he does have to leave at 2:30. And gentlemen, if you could stay at the table. And Mr.
Yes,
Kempton,
Madam.
as we know, was chair of the peer review group. We're always happy to see you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Will Kempton. In my day job, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Orange County Transportation Authority, and somehow somebody talked me into taking on the role as chair of the California High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group. I really appreciate the consideration of Mr. Rossi and Mr. Richard in allowing me to come forward, as I do have a previous commitment that I've discussed with your staff, and thank you, Madam Chair, and my apologies to all of those that were supposed to come before me in the presentations. As you know, the peer review group is an organization that was created statutorily shortly after the passage of Prop 1A. The legislature is our client. We are required under the enabling legislation to review planning, engineering, financing, other elements of the authority's assumptions for high-speed rail. We have a specific requirement and a timeline associated with that for reviewing any of the funding plans that are developed for each of the corridors. So we've had quite a bit of interface with the High-Speed Rail Authority over the past 2 years. We've made numerous presentations before the legislature in terms of some of our findings based on those discussions. Specifically, we've responded to the draft business plan that was produced by the authority in early November of this past year. The funding plan, which came out on November 3rd, we were pretty straightforward, some would say harsh, with respect to our recommendations as a result of the funding plan, because primarily for a couple of reasons. Number one, we saw a very significant opportunity for a stranded investment. That is, an expenditure of a large sum of money in the Central Valley which did not connect with anything. We were concerned with the longer-term funding that was available for the plan. Obviously, that continues to be an issue even today. But the lack of connectivity and some of those issues, the question of the independent utility of the proposed initial investment, were the items that were of most concern to us. Subsequent to publishing the comments on the funding plan, I will tell you the authority has been very gracious in reaching out to us, and we're very receptive to the relationship that has developed. We've been working a lot more closely with the High-Speed Rail Authority in raising issues, getting our questions answered. As a matter of fact, as we now begin to move towards the home stretch on finalizing our comments on the revised business plan, we're going to be meeting with the authority one last time before we release that plan to the legislature. This has afforded us an opportunity to raise issues, to have a dialogue, have a very robust discussion on a number of issues. We have been very impressed by the forthrightness of the members of the authority and the authority staff in terms of responding to our questions. We haven't agreed on everything. We still have some concerns in some areas, but we've gotten a lot of our questions answered, and I think it's made for a much better review of the overall plan. We are, I think, overall very impressed with the revised business plan. I think most notably because the authority has taken into account a lot of the input, not just input from the peer review group, but input from the public. They've been extremely responsive in trying to respond to those concerns. I'm sure they haven't met everybody's tests, but they've been certainly turned that around. We think there's a clearer vision for the program as indicated by virtue of the blended approach. We like the notion of a focus on one of the initial operating segments. They've chosen to focus on the iOS South. We think that's a very critical decision in that it does encompass the closure of the gap between Bakersfield and Palmdale. That has been the missing link in passenger rail service in California for decades. And so even if high-speed rail does not go forward, and I think most of us hope that it does, that investment is not lost. Nor is the investment in the blended approach lost by virtue of listening to the input and focusing on the bookends as we have recommended over the past several months, because those investments on the existing rail services, while they will meet the time test in terms of being able to move those trains per the same speed that they would be able to be moved with high-speed equipment in the case of the Southern California improvements. Obviously, with the electrification of the northern end, the high-speed rail equipment will be able to go all the way to San Francisco. So that connectivity, that blended approach, the focus on the work that is going to be done on the northern end of the initial construction segment, all, I think, is extremely positive. There's a better business model associated with the revised business plan, and it's been the subject of considerable attention by the review group. We like the model that's currently provided, and particularly, as I mentioned, the focus on the iOS South. And the authority did recognize the need to choose a specific initial operating segment, which we think is a very positive movement. And there were several elements of the previous business plan that were confusing. There were job creation figures that were raising questions of concern, issues of equivalent capacity, what it would take to invest in other modes, et cetera, et cetera. And we believe the revised plan has corrected many of the confusion concerning these issues, and we're pleased with that. So let me talk a little bit about some of the continuing concerns, because we do have some. First of all, the financing of the project. We're still very concerned, as we've already heard in the discussion today, about the long-term financing for the project. There's nothing really more to be said on that. There is no dedicated source of funding, either at the federal or the state level. I will say that the potential availability of the cap-and-trade funds is something that's very intriguing. We actually reached out to the Director of Finance and met with Ms. Ana Mata-Santos, and she did provide a compelling argument about the legality and the availability of those funds. Now, you'll have to be the judge, and it's a decision that the legislature will ultimately have to make as to whether or not you choose to provide those monies. But in terms of our discussions with Ms. Mata-Santos, we were concerned about the amount of dollars that would be available. She went over that with us, and over the longer haul, there should be sufficient funding at least to meet the requirement for completion of the initial operating segment, which is when the authority has readily recognized that they can then begin to involve the private sector in the project. We've talked about capital cost estimates. We've talked about demand forecasts. We've talked about operations and maintenance costs and the model being used for that. Those issues in the revised business plan seem to have reached a level of reasonableness from our perspective, but I will tell you that that's a reasonableness that's gauged on some very optimistic assumptions. That's where the risk comes in on those issues, and that's one of the things that the legislature will have to consider in terms of those risks. We find, for example, on the demand forecast, we spent a lot of time with Mr. Rossi on this subject. They've done model testing and comparisons using the Northeast Corridor as an example. The model proves to predict what is actually happening in the Northeast Corridor. So clearly, the model seems to be a reasonable approach. But are the assumptions at a risk level that is acceptable? And I think on those issues, those are the things that the legislature is going to have to take into consideration. Our biggest problem remaining with the program is the project management. We've been mentioning this as an aside. Maybe it was viewed not as directly as some of the other comments we made, simply because we were more focused and vocal about some of those other issues in the past. But the project management is absolutely key to this program. The authority recognizes that, had a number of discussions with the members of the authority staff, or authority itself, and they recognize the need to address that. That is probably the single most significant issue from our perspective at this juncture. The legislature needs to make sure that we have an appropriate project management construct in place, and in fact, we think you should have a comfort level with these efforts prior to the legislature approving funds for construction. There are plans that are developing, and I feel positive from what we're hearing from the authority in this regard, but that is absolutely critical. You should not be entering into a project of this magnitude without an effective project management team in place, and that's, again, I think what our most serious concern at this particular point. So, again, in closing, I would just say that for many of these issues, it really is a point where the authority has responded pretty aggressively and pretty positively to a lot of the concerns that were raised. You're going to have to decide, I think, Madam Chair and members, as to whether or not the risk levels that you're going to have to be taking are worth it. But you have a plan for moving forward that is just about as good as it can be, given the limitations that the state the state is facing for this project. The connectivity, the focus on the initial operating segment south, the investment in the blended approach, and the investments in the bookends are all very positive from that perspective. Long-term funding, the project management aspects of things, and the risk factors continue to be concerns. That completes my presentation, Madam Chair.
Thank you. It's a very different presentation than I've heard in the past. So I think you've really become much more optimistic than in our previous discussions. I know that Ms. Buchanan had a question earlier. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask Mr. Kempton a question, or was this a general question?
General questions. Someone asked specific questions. Mr. Kempton, I'll refer to that first.
Well, I am intrigued by your project management concern, and of course Mr. Richard has said repeatedly he knows that they're not fully staffed, that there are many positions that are vacant. Is that what you're talking about?
That's correct. The fact that you have a huge consultant group that very expert, very capable people that are working on this project. There are some key leadership and management positions that absolutely have to be filled. And in the context of within the constraints of state government, that's problematic in terms of the talent that you need to bring forward for, or that the authority needs to bring forward for this program. So it's a very difficult challenge, and we hope that the legislature and the administration will recognize those issues and allow the authority the flexibility to develop a management team that's necessary for a project of this magnitude.
And Mr. Richard, you've talked about the staffing issues as well. How would you respond to Mr. Kempton's concerns?
I would say he's entirely correct, with one small caveat right at the end, which is I believe, and I stated this the last time I appeared before you, the legislature has given us sufficient resources. The administration has given us sufficient resources. These positions have just gone unfilled for too long. So I don't think Mr. Kempton intended to put that back on you in that way. But it's really on us to develop this. And what I would say is that now that the business plan is produced, and now that we're in front of the legislature with the request for funding, I can tell you that this is really the thing that Mr. Rossi and I and our colleagues have turned our greatest attention to. We need a new CEO for the organization. That person needs to have a deputy. We need somebody managing the projects overall, individual project manager, CFO. Yes, Ms. Buchanan, we need a risk manager. These are the positions that we are talking with people about right now. I'd also like to tell you that we appreciate our colleagues at BT&H, and in particular at Caltrans. We've been working with them to fill a number of the mid-level positions out of kind of advertising through the Caltrans organization. So our teams and the Caltrans teams have been working together, and that's leading in some very good directions. But nothing that Mr. Kempton just said to you would I find in any way incorrect. And I think that the issue is that these are things that we've been doing a lot of work on, and it is our hope that very shortly we'll begin the process of announcing some of these positions so that before too long this would be a conversation that we could have in the past tense.
So your report will be out in a few weeks?
That's correct, Madam Chair. We expect, we have one more meeting scheduled with the authority and staff. That's scheduled for sometime next week, and then we hope to have the report finalized and out to the legislature at the time of the May revise. So mid-month, we'll have our report to you.
Thank you very much. I know you have a plane to catch.
Well, thank you so much for taking me out of turn. Appreciate the consideration of all of the other panelists, and
Okay.
look forward to continuing to work with the legislature and the authority to make this the best project that we can.
Thank you.